30 years ago, on Christmas Eve 1968, millions of people were tuned in to a special event. Apollo 8, which was one of our Apollo flights in our attempt to go to the moon, Apollo 8 was actually beginning its orbit around the moon. And it had flown from the Earth, and Apollo 8 then was the first Apollo flight, and Anders, Bill Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman were the first three astronauts to actually orbit another world, really, if we want to call the moon another world. But they were the first to orbit another world outside of our own planet. And as their command module flew around the moon, they took turn doing images of the moon and Earth, and actually sending them back to Earth. And they read from the book of Genesis, closing with the wish of everyone on wishing everybody happiness on the good Earth. The mission was also famous for the Earthrise image, and that was snapped by Bill Anders as they came around on the fourth orbit on their, and that was the home planet. Could we have, there it is, and that's a very famous picture, the first picture of Earth rising that's taken from outside and you see the moon there in the foreground. Well, today we're going to tell you about that voyage, but first let me introduce my guest for the trip. Many of you know Rich Schmidt. He's taken us on many space journeys, and some of you may remember my grandson, Max Parks, who joined us on the trip to Mars a few months ago. Max works for NASA, and thank you both for coming to tell us about Apollo 8. But first, Max, before we get into Apollo 8, you were working on the Mars mission in NASA. Are you still working on the Mars mission? Or are you?
I am. I spend some of my time working to figure out how to put humans on Mars in the same way that the Apollo missions put humans on the moon.
Oh.
And I also, since we last talked, I've started working at NASA's Goddard Research Center up in Maryland, where I use a big radio telescope to study the atmospheres in the outer solar system.
Ah, atmospheres. Mm-hmm. Well, we can't diverse.
Yeah, that's not the moon's.
We need to talk about Apollo 8. But before we start Apollo 8, what were some of the other missions that we had, Rich, getting to Apollo 8?
Well, they started out with the Gemini and Mercury. Mercury was the first one where they had fellows going out there and see how humans react when you're out in space. And then Gemini came along and they furthered that kind of effort.
And then we had 2 men in that capsule.
Yeah, I didn't count the number of men, but yeah, we had manned operations, whereas in Apollo we had 3 men.
Yep.
In Gemini and the earlier ones we didn't have as many.
So they really had a plan then to get to the moon, because President Kennedy had told us, and actually it was kind of interesting, because President Kennedy, when the Soviets they had the first Sputnik, they had the first orbiter around the world, or around the Earth, and they were getting ahead of us in some other things. They actually had put later on, but they had actually put a translunar mission where they used tortoises and other animals in the capsule. So President Kennedy really was getting concerned, and he then wanted a mission that would essentially get us ahead of the Soviet Union in space. And so that was the plan for the Apollo landing on the moon in this decade, right?
Yeah, when the Sputnik came up, boy, that was a big splash.
Oh, I remember it, yeah.
In the United States, man, we were paying attention. The world was paying attention. That was a wild time.
About a 25-pound, I think about 25 pounds.
Yeah, it wasn't much,
a little
but
thing.
Boy, it made an impression.
And it just beeped.
That's all it did.
That's all it did.
So
but
I remember that, and everybody else remembered that. That was for sure.
Yeah, so.
And but then.
But Kennedy wasn't president then.
No.
This was the late 50s.
You're right.
Yeah.
So we wanted to play a little catch up here and then bypass.
Yep.
And Kennedy's idea is bypass it by putting a man on the moon and getting him back safely.
Well, if we could have the plan, the table that we have, let's look at what the plan was. The table should show us that we have different missions, and
Yeah,
we
it's there.
Yeah, can we zoom in on that a little better?
Try.
All right. There was an A mission that did unmanned test of the Saturn V rocket, and the Saturn V rocket was a big rocket. It was bigger than anything that we'd had up, and so this was an unmanned test of that rocket. We had another mission where we were going to test the Lunar Module, and that was an Apollo 5. C mission was the manned Earth orbital flight, the command service module. That was Apollo 7. And then we were going to test the Lunar Module in a low Earth orbit, and this was Apollo 8. That was the plan, to test the Lunar Module in low Earth orbit for the Apollo 8. Then the idea was then to test the Lunar Module in a medium elliptical Earth orbit of Apollo 9. And the F mission was to test the commands, both of them, in a lunar orbit, and then go land on the moon. Well, things changed, as we'll tell you, because this was the initial plan, but as all plans go, it didn't work out quite that way.
No, they got 3 of the unmanned missions off, and they were successful. They proved the different things that they were trying to do. So they're okay. We're going to put manned mission, and that manned mission became Apollo 1.
Okay.
And Apollo 1, they had them up on the rocket. It was a rehearsal that was going on.
Maybe we
And-
could see the figure of the
Yeah,
3
right.
men in the capsule.
Yeah, right in that rehearsal, though, something went wrong, and that changed things drastically. There was possibly a spark came out and lit a fire, and the oxygen inside was 100%.
It was pure, yeah,
pure oxygen.
Yeah.
And so it was a flash fire, and it doubled the pressure inside that cabin, and melted the hoses that brought the air to the men. And once that happened, then they were exposed to the atmosphere that was inside there. It was now very high carbon monoxide, and they had cardiac arrest immediately. So it was a devastating thing, and it shut down the whole program for about 1.5 years.
Yeah.
They had to investigate this and find out what in the heck happened, and what can we do about it.
So
And
they changed to a liquid, well, not liquid, but a nitrogen, was that? Or-
They had, like the air that we breathe is a mixture of oxygen and nitrogen.
Yeah.
So they went to that. Before this accident happened, people were worried about this 100% oxygen. That was a worrying thing, but they said, oh, this is the right way to go. And the investigation showed that we weren't paying attention to safety as much as we should have done.
Yeah.
And so that's why this thing happened. And they said, okay, what we're going to do is change the fabric that they're wearing. The spacesuits will now be made out of non-flammable material. And we're going to make sure that all safety considerations are done. There was Velcro in there. That caught on fire. They took that stuff out. And so everything was now really safety-centered to make sure that we don't do this kind of a problem again. And that's what it took about 1.5 years.
So that led us then to,
Yeah.
and it certainly delayed, and I'm sure it threatened the whole program is to get to the moon in this decade.
That was the idea, get there by 69.
That's right.
And, with a disaster like this setting you back, we have to figure out ways to get around it. And that's what they did.
So then we had the other Apollo flights that were unmanned. They did test the Saturn V rocket in the order in which they were going, except when we got into, we had some problems in Apollo 6, I believe it was, with the stages, the different stages, and there was a major oscillation in the Saturn V, what they called a pogo oscillation.
Yeah. They ran into problems as they went along. And of course, that's why you do it in steps.
Yep.
You want to find out what the problems are, find out solutions to them. They had this, Apollo 4 was the next one that came after Apollo 1. They canceled out steps 2 and 3. So they went into Apollo 4. That was launched in November of '67, and it was the first flight of the 500 series Saturn V rocket. And it's the first flight of a modified, what they call a Block 2
Command service
module. Yeah. The Block 2 is what's ready for going to the moon. Block 1 was what they could do right away and do it in Earth orbit.
A dummy type of.
Yeah. So that's so Apollo 4 started right in on that Block 2. Apollo 5, the main goal was to test the Lunar Module, the ascent and descent engines. You want to be able to have the thing go down and come back up again. Make sure that that all is working. Apollo 6
That kind of amazed me that we actually did that in orbit. Of course, you've got to test it.
Yes, you have to test it. Yeah, so they were doing that.
Okay.
These are all tricky things to do.
Absolutely.
You know, it's just
Very
not
tricky things.
You got these speeding around the Earth at a very high speed, and you got to do all these. And Apollo 6 was a modified Block 2 command service module, and a Lunar Module test article. Well, that's a sort of a dummy that they had out there, and demonstrated the trans-lunar injection capability of the Saturn V. So they got that down, and they tried that out. And then Apollo 7 was the first manned Apollo mission. And that's the first fully functioning Block 2 command service module. It was launched on a Saturn 1B into Earth orbit. And the mission did what it did that October.
11 October, yeah.
Yeah, it was October of '68. It was doing what Apollo 1 was scheduled to do. And so now they're back on track. They had accomplished what Apollo 1 was supposed to do, and now they could go on from there.
And then we're supposed to test the Lunar Module, but the Lunar Module, it was way behind schedule.
Yeah,
the one that was provided in, I think it was July, had 100 deficiencies or more. that was just, it was one of those things that the program manager saw it, I'm sure, and says, "Okay, that's it. We're not going to handle that one. There's too much to work on."
Yep.
And so the flight that was supposed to take place in December with the Lunar Module, where they would put it in the elliptical orbit, something had to happen, or if they waited for the Lunar Module to be ready and then do the next phase, they would probably go out of the decade for the actual landing on the moon. Is that the way it is?
That's the way it was going, so they didn't want to do that.
And so they made the decision to change crews and do the command service module test with Apollo 8 instead of the Lunar Module test.
Yeah, throughout this whole Apollo program, they had to make adjustments.
Well, you know, and they made good judgments throughout. You know, we've got to really hand it to them, because throughout we had all of these different problems, and for them to be able to fix them and readjust their flight programs and so forth, it was gutsy.
And amazing that you have a government program come in on time.
It was in the decade. That's right.
In the decade, they made it.
All right. Well, let's talk about Apollo 8 now. We had 3 men. We had our Lovell and Anders, and who was the other one?
I got that one.
Borman, Frank Borman. He was a commander.
Commander.
Frank Borman.
Yeah.
So we had those 3 astronauts, and they changed their training because they were the ones to do the lunar module. So they changed a lot of things and got ready in about 3 months' time to do the flight from Earth to actually go orbit the moon and return to Earth. So, Max, can you tell us a little bit about what went on there?
About the flight? Certainly.
Yeah, have the getting into the orbits and or the how did they plan it? How did they plan to go into the?
So, one thing to note about that, Rich was saying about that the previous mission was launched on a Saturn 1B, which is basically like it's the little brother to the Saturn V. It's not. It wasn't so powerful that it could get everything to the moon, but it was powerful enough that it could get their tests into orbit. But on Apollo 8, they did launch on a full stack Saturn V.
Right.
And with that, they were, I believe, some of the first astronauts to pass through the Van Allen belts, which is basically this belt of radiation. Exactly. And people weren't exactly sure how that was going to affect the astronauts. It turns out that it wasn't much more radiation than, say, a chest.
Twice as much as an X-ray is.
Right. It's about the same. Yeah. A little more certainly.
Which is not much.
It's certainly not the lethal radiation that people were worried about. And so the idea was that the Apollo 8 astronauts would go and orbit the moon and then simply return. The whole trip took, I believe, about 3 days, a little less. Then they entered the orbit around the moon, and then they returned.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting when they discarded their first booster rocket, and of course it's traveling along with them. And they fly in formation with it, and then they practice turning around and as if they were going to extract a lunar module from it, and so they sort of played with it. And as a matter of fact, they got about an hour behind schedule doing this, playing with that. And then where did they send the booster? They sent it on an orbit around the sun.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, that's where it was.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit more about how we got to the moon. Maybe we could see the translunar, the one with the.
I believe that. Yeah, there should be a diagram. It's supposed to have. Well, it is that one. It was supposed to have a white background. That'll be harder to see. I think there might be
there's
another
another one.
Yeah. Let's try the next figure.
Yeah, which shows us that the orbit that we went from Earth in was not something that was pointed at the moon, but it was actually an orbit that would have gone around the sun as with the Earth and the object was to fly in front of the moon as it passed, and as it passed the moon's gravity would pick it up, bring it in, and then it could get into a lunar orbit. Is that right?
That's exactly right. One thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about going places in space is you really have to imagine that you're not, you can't just aim at your goal.
You can't shoot at the moon.
Exactly. If you shoot at the moon, I mean, think about it like this. Yes, that's exactly right.
Tell us about that.
So you can see it's a very curved path. It's not a straight line to the moon, because if you aim straight at the moon, well, it takes 3 days to get there, so the moon will be 3 days forward in its orbit. So instead, you have to aim. You have to aim ahead, and then you will catch up, or rather, the moon catches up to you. And as the moon catches up to the Apollo 8 mission, it falls into an orbit around the moon. And they had to sort of fire their engines to slow down and enter orbit.
They had to do that on the back side of the moon, because as it came up around, they had to fire their engines on the back side of the moon. So we didn't know anything about what was happening.
Right. They couldn't call home.
And if they missed, there was a couple of things. Either they could go into the moon, or they could go into an orbit around the sun, or a larger orbit around the Earth. And if they went in a larger orbit around the Earth, maybe they could get back. But going into the moon wasn't any fun.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind, I mean, we like to talk about Apollo 11 as the big mission that landed on the moon.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that the Apollo 8 astronauts, at that time, when they are ready to fire their engines on the far side of the moon, they are farther from Earth than any human has ever been.
Yeah.
And so, not only are they farther from Earth than any human has ever been, they can't call home. Mission control is dead silent.
That's right.
And maybe they appreciated that after 3 days of of people constantly talking to them. They get some peace and quiet. But it does mean that whatever happens, it's on them.
They were probably very lonely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're now in an orbit around the moon, and they take pictures of the moon, and they get pictures of the landing site that's planned for Apollo 11. And they actually have some TV shows while they're orbiting the moon. And on Christmas Eve, they read from the Genesis. They sent all the messages, and then the Deke Slayton, I believe it was, sent them a little brandy. They had, of course, that was a surprise. But Frank Borman says, no, we can't touch that while we're here. And as a matter of fact, some of that, as the story goes, some of that brandy is still unopened. They took it back to Earth. And their wives had some presents stowed away for them, too. So they had a little Christmas. Santa Claus was on the moon, too, I guess.
Guess so. Yeah,
Okay.
You probably don't want to be drinking and driving, certainly not drinking and flying your billion-dollar spacecraft.
I think you've got a good point there.
Yeah.
All right, so we've accomplished our mission. We orbit the moon, and on the fourth orbit, maybe we bring that Earthrise up again. On the fourth orbit is when they first see the Earth, because it's not a common thing to see the Earth from the moon. I didn't realize that, but Earthrise was kind of a special thing. And so they got that, and that was a famous picture that blew people's minds, and so they could see Earth and realize that really we were away from Earth and looking at it. So we do our orbits. I think we had about 10 orbits, and then we just do our getting away from the moon. So on our way back, what do we do? Anything special on the way back?
Well, I think it's the reason you do these tests is so that you can figure out, you make sure that your reentry process is important, or is working, because it is important. They carried with them the same kind of rocket that the Apollo 11 would use in the future, another thing to remember about, if you're going to go the farthest away that anyone's ever gone, that also means you're going to come back from the far, what goes up must come down. And so that means that returning from the moon, you're carrying a lot more speed than if you're just coming back from low Earth orbit, as most other people had. And so this was, sort of one of the first big tests of, the reentry mechanisms for hitting Earth's atmosphere at a much higher speed than people were used to.
And before we get back to Earth, there was another story that kind of interested me. on the way to the moon, I think it was Lovell that did some navigation. They actually had a built-in sextant on the module, and so he was able to shoot stars and determine their locations, and they had a few corrections, but they were right on. But he tested himself on being able to navigate with the sextant. Well, on the way back, they hit a button that sort of eliminated where they were, and the command and service module thought it was back in the launch position. So they've got a problem. Lovell is able to do the navigation problems with this sextant and make the corrections, and it took about 20 minutes, but he was able to do that. And I thought that was a very interesting, thing to be able to do.
Certainly.
A very fortunate thing.
Yeah,
That's for sure.
Hitting the wrong button is not so good.
No.
But to be able to correct it, and that apparently came into being on the Apollo 13, I think it was. They had problems there, so they had to do some self-navigation. All right. Well, we come back and we test our reentry with the people, which is...
Well, that reentry is a difficult thing.
Oh, it is.
You come in at too steep an angle, you burn up.
Yeah.
You come in at too little, you skip off.
Yeah.
Because the Earth has an atmosphere that, you'd think it's not very solid, but you can bounce off of it.
Yeah.
You come in too fast. And so they have to hit it just right.
It amazes me that they're able to do the calculation and the burns to land within a few miles
Isn't that something?
of the target.
It is really great.
Oh,
Yeah. All these things, it's so precise. It has
well,
to be.
and there's no, there's no way of flying the command service module. I mean, it's a blob coming through Earth, and you've got to be precise on your burns and the timing of it.
Interestingly, that's not entirely true.
Yeah.
And
There is a little.
yeah.
not-
so
but
so
not
when he
much.
was saying that you can skip off the Earth's
Yeah.
atmosphere, that's because it is to us it looks like a sort of fat
Blob.
teardrop. It's
Yeah.
you would say that is a rock, a blob. But the way it is shaped, it actually does create a little bit of lift, like an airplane's wing.
Yeah.
And so, when you were saying, if you come in at too shallow an angle, it does skip off in that it creates lift and then just goes back up. It's not like it's going to go out into space again, but it just means you don't come home where you thought and when you thought,
yeah.
and you might not have the supplies to survive that long.
That's
So they
right.
had to make sure that they came down where they intended, and that was why the module had that aerodynamic shape, is so that they could do
Do a little
do it
change.
exactly, so that they could generally guide it to where you're trying to go.
Yeah, and that's created by the internal arrangement of things, because everything is not symmetrical.
Right.
It's arranged so that you do have that little. I remember that. Well, they landed, and they landed upside down, and they've got these little balloons that they deploy that rights the capsule, so they had to do that. And the name of the carrier was the Yorktown, right?
I
They
believe
landed
that's
a
correct.
few miles from that. It took about 45 minutes for the helicopters to get out, to get them out. And bobbing around in the ocean for 45 minutes after you've been in space, that probably wasn't any fun either.
Yeah, though I'm sure they would be happy to just be back.
That's
Just be
right.
bobbing
Yeah.
around in the ocean.
Yeah.
I think you've got a point there.
They
not
are-
exactly
they're
terra
alive.
firma,
That's
but,
what counts.
That's right. Well, when they were heroes, and the country sort of treated them as heroes, didn't it?
Sure. You don't do something like that without a lot of trepidation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a risky thing that they did, and it was part of their job, but they knew there was a risk to it.
Well, they knew when they left, it was maybe about a 50% chance that it would work. And
I don't know what the percentages were.
Well, I read 50%.
Was it? Wow.
And I wonder if it really was 50%.
Yeah.
Because there was so many things that could go wrong.
But they had tried out a lot of these things ahead
That's
of
why
time.
they had to do. That's
Yeah.
why they had to do it.
That's
in
why
sequence.
all those steps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we got to the moon and back.
Yep.
So I thank you all very much for coming along with the ride.
Okay.
And did we see Santa on the way?
I didn't see him.
Max, did you see Santa on the way?
He wasn't in the small window that the astronauts had.
It was kind of hard to see, huh?
Yeah, he was tailgating.
That's right.
Yeah.
And while they're coming down, they're probably not looking for sleds in the air.
Don't think so.
And besides, Santa's in a low Earth orbit.
Indeed, yeah.
And he takes all night to get around the Earth, and the astronauts only take 90 minutes, huh?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So the astronauts are flying then. It takes 90 minutes. That's 5 miles a second, right?
I don't even have that math off the top of my head.
No.
Max, you're supposed to be fast.
I can tell you it's 17,000 miles an
Yeah,
hour.
that's why.
Well, let's
you know,
say
I remember too.
18,000, and then that makes it easy to make 5 miles a second.
I don't know that. Indeed.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. And